Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Not D&D. This week we are going to be painting the town red with SoulMuppet. Let's try that again. SoulMuppet Publishing. I always stumble on your name. I don't know why. Is it just me? Try that again. Okay. Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode of Not D&D, where we'll be painting the town red. We have SoulMuppet Publishing here. We have Zach joining us. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Jess.
I'm really excited to talk to you about this game because the tagline that you told me about it was like a depressing game about partying and falling in love and sad gay vampires. And we've previously had you on to talk about Orbital Blues, which is sad space cowboys. So moving on to sad vampires, new genre. Very excited to talk about it more. So as previously mentioned, you have been on the show before, and normally I introduce guests and then ask, your background and history of games, but we've already kind of done that. So if anyone's interested in knowing more about you, they can go back and listen to Orbital Blues. So instead, I'm going to ask you what your gaming highlights have been since you were last on the show, which is about a year, I think. So end of the year of 2023 up till now in 2024, what have your gaming highlights been?
So I've had two big gaming highlights. The first is that I've actually had a regular in-person RPG game at my house every week for the past 2 months, which has been amazing.
That's very impressive.
We've been playing Swivers by the Melsonian Arts Council with Luke Gearing and David Hoskins. So Guy Ritchie Cockney crime simulator has been the pitch there, and there's been lots of shenanigans. And the other thing I've started doing, which is a bit unusual, is I've got really into play-by-post role-playing games. A lot of
really?
stuff on Discord, not as time sensitive or during a session, but kind of dropping in and out of scenes with a GM, moving around and playing in sort of lots of individual little scenes rather than a big game. So I've been playing some Fallen London RPG, not the official one that's coming out, but a homebrew version that my friend has made. I've played a bunch of Vampire the Requiem, and I also played some Sword of the Crown and the Unspeakable Power, which is like a PBTA game about politicalling in a sort of fantasy kingdom. So lots more RPGs, which I've been able to play this year by merit of moving offline into sort of text-based formats and also moving back in person. So it's been good to play some games.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm so interested by those play-by-post games because I've seen them and I've heard a bit about them. I've not tried them myself. And I know there are some games that are specifically designed to work that way. So I should probably get someone on that's made one to talk about it because I think that's something a bit different and interesting.
Yeah,
so,
it's a fascinating format. It's been really interesting because normally in a D&D game, when everybody's playing at the same time you're in the room, you kind of can't get into a really detailed single person political conversation because it's then taking the oxygen away from other people in the room. Whereas the asynchronous format means that as long as your GM is down to do a scene with you, you can do some really interesting stuff. So, and it allows you to sort of be a bit more self-indulgent than you would be in a RPG game with other people at the table. So it's kind of almost can be like a solo or a duet game at times where you're kind of mostly playing with yourself or one other person while having all the other stuff when the Avengers all get together and all the people in the campaign are in the same room for once, as long as you get the scheduling right.
Oh, that sounds really cool. I like that. Thanks for sharing that with us. Well, speaking of self-indulgence, should we talk about Paint the Town Red? How's that for a segue? So tell us, what's the pitch? What is Paint the Town Red?
So Paint the Town Red is a game about being dead inside. A long time ago, something very, very bad happened to you in that you died, and that sucked and it hurts. And you're living through now this long immortality, which is filled with sadness and loneliness and the want to not be that. The game is kind of about seeking pleasure and self-fulfillment in the little things, and the way that we do that is kind of by using vampirism, the way I've kind of talked about it, as a metaphor for lots of other things to do with depression and hedonism and mental health and queerness and liberation and rebellion, and kind of using everything that is there, all these metaphors, to tell some really powerful and potent stories where you also get to be a brooding, sexy vampire. So playing it is a lot of fun. The sessions can sort of be quite introspective, but
Yeah.
they tend to feel less like a sort of fantasy adventure where you're trying to save the princess and get the gold, and more like a sort of the worst Saturday night you've ever had. That might also be the best Saturday night you've ever had.
A really
You know.
messy, hedonistic sort of situation. Okay, great. We had last month, we were talking about Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, and so that's like a
Mm.
solo game, obviously, with being a vampire, which has some similar themes, obviously. But this is a game to be designed with other people as a group.
Mhm.
So what sort of happens when we're playing? Because as you say, I can imagine this being quite introspective and things like that. But you're wanting to play with other people and tell a shared story. So what do sessions look like? How do you structure a game?
Yeah, so the kind of space that your characters live in is that you've got two scores that are kind of replacing your health. And
Mm-hmm.
in Orbital Blues, we did this thing called, which we jokingly refer to as sad for XP, right? You
Yeah.
got experience points by role playing what was happening with you emotionally, and sort of by displaying your trauma in big or little ways, you could gain
Mm-hmm.
experience points. In Paint the Town Red, we've gone a step further than that, and we've gone with sad for health, right?
Okay.
And your HP bar, your pulse, is literally showing how human you feel in a given moment and how
Okay.
far from the monstrosity of this sort of depressive, languishing, undead state you are. So, what happens when you start the session is that all of these characters are in a different emotional state, because not only are they considering their pulse, they're also considering the second score called their chaos, which is kind
Okay.
of how personally and socially chaotic they are and how that impacts the city and the world around them.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's happening as you play is all of these numbers, your characters are going to start off in different places and be in a position where they want to get their pulse up. That's like the objective of the game, is to be as
Mm-hmm.
happy as possible, right?
Yeah.
But doing that, the ways that you get your pulse up might be, well, the main one is indulging your passions, right? You are drinking blood is one of them. You can
Mm-hmm.
get your pulse up by like drinking a human and murdering them. Or you
Sure.
can do it by indulging in your passion, which might be anything from bare knuckle boxing to playing cards to turning invisible to like weird stuff like going to the theater or sleeping in other people's graves. Like there's all these options for gaining pulse, but
Mm-hmm.
in turn they create chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what ends up happening throughout the session is that your characters are going to go somewhere interesting and do something interesting in an attempt to get their pulse up and feel human, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so you have this kind of quest where your characters are literally, as you play, climbing up the Maslowian pyramid of
Mm-hmm.
of vampirism, while also having to make sure their actions and the chaos it creates and the impact that's going to have on the world around them and the people around them doesn't undermine the things they've built for themselves by knocking out the levels below them. So essentially, you get everyone into the same room and you have a party of
Okay.
some kind somewhere at some point in the Earth's long and splendid history that we're pulling upon for this game. Because the other thing that's worth mentioning about Paint the Town
Mm-hmm.
Red is it's set in the greatest cities in the world where vampires gather and an undead community has grown. And
Mm-hmm.
because that's the place you go to feel like a real person, to these
Yeah.
huge, wonderful, big places. And so we play through with history as we play. You
Mm-hmm.
might have an adventure set in somewhere like ancient Rome or Victorian London or Great Depression New York. And as you play a campaign, kind of like in Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, your characters move from place to place and time to time
Mm-hmm.
uh, as they sort of pass through the ages. You can kind of see how the characters change over a really large amount of time and how the world changes around them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of sort of looking at history and historical places
Mm-hmm.
that we use to act as a backdrop for our story. So it's easier to understand than some fantasy place,
Sure.
because we all understand history
Mm-hmm.
most people who play RPGs have at least one period in history they're really fascinated by. And my
Yeah.
challenge is to allow that person to make a vampire from that place and time, or indeed run a campaign of Paint the Town Red in that place.
Yeah, and I suppose, as you say, it's a campaign you could always do through different time frames as well, in theory, because
Absolutely,
you can
yeah.
be like, yeah, these characters lived for X hundred more years and are meeting up to have
Yeah.
another party.
That
So
is a very
yeah.
explicit mechanic is,
Mhm.
and now we skip for 500 years and end up in a new place. It's something that you kind of do in the pacing. So the
Mhm.
idea is that a campaign you do, if you're playing 10 sessions, you'd probably do 3 different cities, each of them
Mhm.
for 3 to 4 sessions at a time. And you
Okay.
kind of pass through time at that pace as your characters paint the town red and are forced to
Mhm.
leave because of the terrible decisions that they've made in any given place, because characters in this game tend to make terrible decisions because of the kind of people we're asking them to be.
Yeah, I can.
So yeah,
That makes sense. It's indulging your vices at the cost of everyone else. So we briefly mentioned, so the rule system is based on Orbital Blues. So if people are familiar with Orbital Blues, the rules are going to feel, reasonably comfy and not too foreign. You've already mentioned there's a couple of changes that have taken place with, like you say, your pulse and like the chaos. What other elements are different in this game if you're coming from Orbital Blues? What would you notice to be different?
yeah. I mean, so the thing we've brought over is mainly the core resolution mechanic and the way
Hmm.
that characters are built.
Okay.
You're rolling 2 dice, you're adding a stat to it. You've got 3 stats, which are your savagery, allure, and duplicity. Those are
Hmm.
anywhere between 0 and 2. You then are looking for a 9 on a check.
Hmm.
You can have advantage and disadvantage, and those make things easier and harder, respectively, around your same fixed target number. You can also always reroll dice, which is something that we've pulled over from Orbital Blues and Best Left Buried. You're just going to gain chaos as you try to re-roll dice and make the situation better for you, or at least try to. And your but the things we've changed are all kind of to do with the session structure and pacing.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a lot of mechanics added to do with like the city and how it feels and how to generate characters and sort of what the different parts of the city are and how you interact with them.
Hmm.
Sort of rules for tracking relationships with contacts and factions,
Hmm.
because they're much more present. Your Orbital Blues characters are always going to meet NPCs and meet factions, but they're much more likely to move around. So basically, we've added a load of rules to do with tracking the emotional state of your vampires and
Yeah.
also their social state in relation to the rest of the city,
Okay.
um, while undergoing the goal of keeping everything simple and easy to use. And then the final thing we've done is added some pacing tools specifically designed to deal with the fact that this isn't going to feel like your traditional like RPG where you go into a dungeon and fight a guy with a spear.
Sure.
Um, this is very much more of a slice of life RPG thing where you're like
Hmm.
meeting, talking to people, doing things, dealing with more like emotional stakes often.
Hmm.
Slice of unlife is something that's come up quite regularly when I'm
Yeah.
talking about the game with people.
Hmm.
So it's more kind of like pacing tools and advice to help you run those kind of more social role playing situations,
Yeah.
and keeping things, giving tools to the GM to make the game as easy to use as possible.
Yeah. Do you have some examples of those? Because I think some people, if you've run like a lot of D&D and, like you say, a more traditional role playing game, which is like your goal is to go rescue this thing, go there, do that, kill the people,
Mhm.
solve the puzzle, this might feel a bit strange. So what advice do you have for GMs if
Oh,
you've if
yeah.
you they've
So
run something like that is a very goal orientated game to something like this that is more about you know the relationships and those kind of feelings? What advice do you have for that?
So the first thing we do is we start every session with this mechanic called "It's all happening tonight," which means
Hmm.
that it's kind of like a montage sequence that kind
Hmm.
of builds your characters into the city and seeds some information. Depending on their emotional state, how much pulse and chaos they have, they're going to roll on a different list of random encounters or sort of like what they are doing right now. That really reflects their emotional position and health within the setting and
Hmm.
kind of allows you to cascade new bits of information. This
Yeah.
gives each player rather, a little scene that lasts anywhere from like 30 seconds to a couple of minutes,
Okay.
that then kind of have the characters all start somewhere separately, and the advice says pick somewhere your characters are going to hang out and have them all together there kind of at that moment. And then it's their job to go and find something, talk to a person, find out what they want, work out what's happening, find the best party in the whole city you can and go there. So what that means is kind of adding these little interstitial scenes to kind of give your characters context physically and emotionally about where they are within the space, and then sending them off in that direction. And in terms of like helping GMs, the core book just has lots of advice on how to run scenes with lots of characters in them, sort of what those environments will look like, how many characters you would want to have in a given location at a time, and sort of advice on like running a scene that feels more like a party than a scripted combat encounter, and sort of a lot of advice around that. And one of the advice things we give is combine a trope from undead fiction, right? A zombie or a vampire, or a particular character you've seen somewhere before, and then smash it against something from a party or a nightclub or a bar, and just smush them together, and use that kind of spark table to generate something novel for your characters. And that can sort of be the things they see as they're interacting, because ultimately we all understand those base elements of what those things look like. We've all seen a vampire film or been to a party, right? So using that to generate these scenes together and kind of cascade information there for the players to interact with. Because the principal difference to this compared to a scripted game is that we're expecting the GMs to be much more reactive and expecting the players to be much more driven with what they want, because we've written into their character sheet that you are a vampire, you have these passions, you're looking for these certain things, right? And from that, characters draw meaning, and then as a result, GMs have to do less prep, because you're generally reacting to what your players want to do, rather than going out of your way to do something or make something happen as the GM.
So in terms of GM style, it's like you say, not too much prep, but it's more like reacting to what your players want to do and dropping things in and seeing how they kind of want to play with it.
Giving lots of advice for them to think on their feet, the GM is part of the game.
Yeah. I know for some people that is that's like a new skill. So that's really good that there's advice in there, because some people I think find that really intimidating. For me, I love the sound of it, because you just said less prep. So I'm like, great. So I'm actually going to get to go to the table. Less prep sounds really good to me. So one thing I want to talk about with the game is I've been scrolling through so people watching the video can see. It's a beautiful looking book. The art direction. Could you talk a little bit about your inspiration and your goals with the way the book looks and the artwork?
Yeah, of course. So I've been lucky enough here to work with legendary tabletop role-playing game graphic designer Johan Noor, who's responsible for books such as Mork Borg, Cyborg, and Into the Odd. I've been trying to work with Johan on something for literally years. I've asked him to do almost every project I've done since like 2021. Maybe even before that, actually. And once I knew that like this was something I wanted to make, I approached him and said, "Hey, this is the one, bud. I need you to get on board with me." And he did. And I was so happy that I've been able to work with him on this. What you'll be looking at right now is some of the bits of art that we've commissioned for the main book, and also the spreads from the free quick start version that exists on the SoulMuppet website right now. You'll be able to get it from our backerkit page or our website or any number of other places. And that book is too big to be a quick start. It's actually like an 82 page, like full color illustrated book that Johan and our illustrators and our great graphic designer, Minerva Majanda, has put together for us. And a lot of the influence from it came from wanting to look like quite different to other vampiric books, and a big sort of emphasis on the emotional states of the vampires as something that we explored in the graphic design. If you have a PDF in front of you open right now, you'll be able to see that there is blood pouring out of the gutters of the book.
Yes.
and it starts off each chapter in a quite sort of modest bit that you'll barely be able to see if you're like working from a closed book. But as you pass through the chapter, blood begins to stream from the gutters, increasing intensity as the pulse and chaos of the book ramps up. And then as a new chapter begins, the cycle resets. A lot of the art we're working with is drawn from the public domain in this quick start, but we're messing around with most of these when we bring them into the full book. Sometimes it's like a kit bash of a public domain piece you've seen. Sometimes we're covering it in blood or claw marks or shadows or something like that. And other times we've commissioned an amazing artist from across the world to make something weird and beautiful and unusual. A lot of the times what we've allowed is that we've requested, as we're commissioning the art, we've been talking with the creatives around it about how the book works and what it means emotionally, and having the physical and visual and kinetic senses of the world be affected by the moods of the characters you're seeing, right? So a vampire who is at a party, who is loving life, who is with someone they care about, is in a bright space. There are vibrant blood splatters everywhere. The lines are clean and crisp and sharp, and detail is prominent. Whereas when we're looking at a piece where a vampire is in sadness, there is a much reduced color palette. The only bright color we will see in there might be a single glisten of red upon the piece, and otherwise we're working in these like looming, dark, murky shapes. But you can see an example on the screen right now. This is a piece that's been messed around with by Johan. This is like Queen Maeve, who's like an Irish warrior queen. It's like quite a famous piece of art, and we've just covered it in blood, and it looks great.
Yeah.
And you'd look at that and think it's an illustration for a vampire RPG rather than like some piece of 700-year-old art that we've messed around with.
Just splattered blood.
Yeah. Just
done. Yeah, great.
Done, yeah. I mean, you say that, but yeah, a lot of the time that's literally what we're doing. Adding little squiggles and things and weird shadows and blood splatters and lightening everyone's faces so they're pale and horrible. It's an energy and aesthetic that is appealed to really consistently throughout the book. And what we've tried to do as well is that we've had different illustrators brought in for different adventures that we're doing. So you'll always be able to tell where in the book you are and what the emotional state of the characters are by the type of art that you're seeing. So there's lots of sort of movement there. And, Johan's created this really visually striking world alongside the talented artists we've been lucky enough to work with. So it's been a real labor of love from both of us and also all the rest of the team to make it look the way it does.
Absolutely. It looks really stunning, and some of the art pieces are really eye-catching. So if you're listening to the podcast, there's a link to the free quick start guide, so you can download it and take a look at everything we just discussed there. So you can download that and see. So I think, like you mentioned, the visual is really supporting how it's meant to feel, and so people have a sense of it. But when you were creating the game, what was your intention? I know what's your intention with how the game's going to feel like playing it? Like, obviously, when you put something out in the world, people will pick it up and do what they like with it. But as the creator, what is your intention for the experience that we're going to have when we sit down and play a game?
I wanted to recreate some of the sort of frenzied chaos of vampiric fiction. Specifically a lot of the stuff around hunting and those kind of energies, and add that sort of bloodlust and frenzy to the players, and really incentivize them to act in ways that are against their interest because of their feelings. I want to trick them into making as many stupid decisions as possible so I can come back and bite them in the face in the future and call them idiots. And the other thing that's kind of happening there is a sort of and re-mythologization of vampiric mythology, right? Specifically thinking about stuff like the original Dracula is like about some really nasty things. The vampire in, Dracula himself is a metaphor for immigration, like racial hatred and anti-Semitic hatred of Eastern Europeans. And sort of the bestial character there is like moving around and acting in ways that make it very clear to you what Bram Stoker thought about the character. A lot of that is lost in modern interpretations of Dracula. There's kind of been a shift towards the theatrical and the stage version specifically of Dracula is the one we see mostly adapted, but sort of trying to take all of the things we think about vampire fiction and then reconstitute and weaponize everything to be used as part of a metaphor that I'm trying to tell that is ultimately about mental health and my personal sense of queerness, isolation, and hedonism that is present in everything I do now. And the fact that at the worst of times, I have felt all of those things about myself and wanted to feel different ways and sought different things. And you've asked such a question because there's so many things the game is trying to make and do at once. And that almost leads to the chaos of it. But the short version is there's something in the idea of the vampire that many people associate with themselves. And there's something in the metaphors of what that can be that often feels very universal to enjoyers of fiction. And using that to, say something meaningful about community and health and relationships and memory and about 1,000 other things. It's big and messy, but there are stories to be told and things to be explored using the game as a vehicle.
Yeah, I like that. I think what you said was just really interesting there, and I kind of am a bit flummoxed for more questions. So I kind of was like, yeah, you've summarized it really well and just drawn us into the world and the game. So I'm just going to say, the game is now currently live on backerkit, so people can pick it up. What stage is the game in terms of creation? Like if we back on backerkit now, when will we get our greasy mitts on the full game? I know the quick start is available now.
So quick start's been out for about 3 to 4 months digitally, and it's available in physical if you come up to me in person and ask me for one normally, but they're not shipping around yet. The game is fully written, so there's no design left to do. We've got a bunch of art and illustration happening for it at the moment. We're most of the way done. There are 6 adventures that are part of the crowdfunding project you'll be able to get a hold of. There's 1 in the free quick start, 3 in the core book, and 2 in these like adventure envelope pamphlet things that we're doing that are like full of cards and props to like generate the city as you play. We're estimating that we think it's going to be about 6 months to completion. Hopefully digital's in February, physicals shortly after. But obviously, as these projects grow more popular, they become harder to print and distribute, and more things have to be moved around, and things can go wrong. And it all depends on how many stretch goals we hit and what the stuff we decide to add to the project. But I'm optimistic that we can get everything delivered nice and soon, and books will be in people's hands before you can rise from a century-long slumber.
Very good. Sounds great. Okay, well, thanks so much for sharing, talking about the game and sharing it with us. Like we said, if any of that sounds interesting to you at all, please, check out the backerkit, because the best way to support indie tabletop creators is to buy their stuff. And you can also pick up the quick start guide for free to check it out and see if it's for you as well. So Zach, thanks so much for coming on. So looking forward to this project and looking forward to having you back another time for the next thing that you do. But before you go, I will ask the question I always ask, is if you have any recommendations for any other games. And the rules are it can't be one of your own games that you've made, and it can't be D&D.
Okay, well, I was gonna say thousand-year-old vampire, but that's scuppered me
I
there
meant
because we
sorry.
talked about it earlier. So
Sorry.
yeah, well, if you've not checked out the not D&D episode where I assumed you chat with Tim about you've met a thousand-year-old vampire, you
Yes.
should read Thousand-Year-Old Vampire because it's a very good solo game about
Hmm.
playing an immortal RPG. Sorry, an immortal vampire that you're journaling. But in that case, I'm going to say that you should check out Dead Letter Society
Oh.
by Rory Montfort, which is
Hmm.
a solo journaling game about vampires and has a
Hmm.
bunch of really gorgeous art and is like a great combination for if you've got stuck into the paint the town red quick start, you want to do something else to do with vampires, I'd have a look at Dead Letter Society and then have a play with that.
That's a great recommendation. Thanks very much for that. Well, that's all this week. So thanks again, Zach, for coming on. Always pleasure talking to you. And thank you for everyone that watched and listened. The links to everything we talked about are in the show notes, so you can check everything out there. And we will be back next week with another game to share with you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks so much for having me, Jess. And see you soon, listeners.
Okay, cool. Let's end that recording.